Hello, students, and welcome to the fashion seminar. We are very excited to continue our seminar series, Fashioning Sustainability, and I am one of the co-leaders of this seminar, along with my colleague, Sean McDonald. And we are very pleased to welcome Dr. David Montgomery to our seminar series today. And Dave has been working on the intersection of soil systems, food production, and fiber. And he has written a lot about sort of food, fodder, and fiber as it relates to re-envisioning how we do agriculture and improving, in particular, how agriculture works with soil systems. So we're very excited to have Dave here today, and it's a new look at how we do fashion, coming to it from the lens of fiber and fodder and agricultural soils. So I'm super excited to welcome Dave. So Dave, welcome to the seminar.
Thank you, Eli. Thank you, Sean. It's a pleasure to come in and talk to you today. And it's a little odd for a geologist to be talking about fashion, particularly when my wife heard I was being talking at a fashion-oriented seminar. Her eyes rolled right around her head.
Well, Dave, before you get started, one of the traditions of this seminar is we often start the seminar with a land acknowledgement, and Sean always does that with his super terrific voice, which is like, I feel, Sean, like I'm in a real like movie studio when you speak. But Sean is feeling a little under the weather today, so I am going to take a moment to do the land acknowledgement today, and then we'll get started with Dave. So here at the University of Washington, we acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples of this land, which touches the shared waters of all the tribes and bands in the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. And we are glad you could join us today. So, Dave, are you gonna, do you need any, are you still a co-host, and do you have the capacity to share your screen?
I think I am, and let's find out. So we will, I'll try and share my screen. And hopefully what you're seeing is a big circular economy logo. If that's working, I'll say a few words to start. What I'd really like to do today is mostly focus on discussion and give people an opportunity to talk about this topic. I got first sort of interested in thinking about sort of the role of clothing and fiber and farming and how all that links into a circular economy view of things. Through writing some books looking at the effect of the way how people treat land affects soil and how that has affected human societies. And that ended up a couple years ago, I ended up being asked, my wife and I were asked to give a talk at a fashion conference back in New York, looking explicitly at the issue of fiber production in a circular economy and how to think about sort of the future of clothing and what we wear, how we grow it, how we use it, how we dispose of it, all within this context of a circular economy. Now, a lot of the literature you see when we talk about a circular economy is about manufacturing, as this sort of logo is really kind of keyed towards. But when you think about all the things that people rely on, clothing, things that are made out of things that can be grown in the soil, really offer a really good opportunity to return items once we're done with them as people, once we've extracted the use we want from them, to return them back to the soil so that they can be reprocessed by soil life back into the raw materials for growing new fiber and things that can be put into clothing. So my introduction to the circular economy really came from thinking about land degradation. And this map just shows you a map of the global soil degradation that the UN put together a few years ago, looking at the state of the world's farmland. The only thing I really want you to take away from this today is there's a lot of color on that map. There's a lot of orange and yellow areas where the soil land has been degraded. And by degraded, I mean that it's been degraded in its ability to produce high volumes of crops without chemical supplementation. There's a whole bunch of other issues in terms of agrochemical agriculture we could go into, but in terms of land degradation, there's an awful lot of the world's farmland that has been degraded. And the estimates that I've been able to come up with globally are that something around a third of the world's farmland has been degraded enough that it's really kind of out of economic viability for production. And that's not a issue that is just a modern issue. It has affected societies in the past as well. And I got into thinking about the problem of land degradation and soil degradation through writing this book, Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations. I know some of you are in our seminar where we're reading the books that you'll see the covers of here today. I'm going to give you the super short summary of them as we go through here. But Dirt looked at the way that how people treated land in the past affected the longevity and viability of civilizations. And you can trace the problem of soil erosion, soil degradation back to the demise of ancient civilizations, going back to Neolithic or Bronze Age Europe, classical Greece, Rome, the Southern United States, Central America, and other societies around the world that I wrote about in Dirt. And they shared a sort of a common theme in terms of what it was that led to land degradation, and that was over tillage, plowing. When we plow the soil, it exposes the organic matter in the soil to oxidation and accelerated decay by soil life, which has led, and since the European colonization of North America, to a reduction in the soil organic matter content, the soil carbon content in North American farmland soils by roughly 50%. The study that's up on the screen now from the journal Sustainability from 5 years ago concluded that the soil organic matter content of many soils in North America is only about 50% of the level present at the time when they were converted from forests or prairies to farmlands. In other words, we've drawn down the carbon batteries of our farmland soil across North America by roughly half with a couple centuries of conventional style farming in terms of tillage, followed then by the development of modern agrochemical intensive agriculture. What that's done to a lot of soils across North America is turned stuff that had been this rich, dark earth over there on the left into stuff like this khaki tan soil on the right. These are identical soils from neighboring farms in North Carolina. You can probably guess which one has been conventionally farmed for the last 100, 150 years, and which one was a farm that was abandoned about the same time and let revert to forest. Yep, the forest one is over here, the modern conventional agricultural soils on the right. The only difference between these soils are how they've been treated for the last century and a half. They're the same parent material in the same climate, but they've been treated differently. It's the farmer that has made the difference in terms of the carbon content of these soils and their native fertility. If there's any gardeners out there, you probably would rather be gardening in this stuff than in this stuff for good reason. And Eli, as a farmer, can probably back me up on that. But in any case, the problem of soil degradation is a serious problem that has been plagued agriculture, and not just the kind of agriculture that's growing fibers for our clothing, but the agriculture that feeds us as well. And so writing Dirt led me to ask the questions of, is soil restoration possible? Could we actually reverse the pattern of historical land degradation that limited the longevity of human societies? And again, I'll refer you to the Dirt book if you want details on that. But where I started really becoming convinced that we could turn that picture that I showed you with that initial map around was in my own yard, because I had the great fortune to marry a biologist who is a plant whisperer. And when we bought a house in North Seattle, it had horrible soil. We wrote about our experience rebuilding the soil and restoring fertility to our land in the hidden half of nature. And I wrote that with Anne Beclay. And she was really the brains behind how we transformed our yard. When we bought the house, it had soil that looked a lot like that degraded farmland soil I just showed you. Khaki stuff, hardly any organic matter. There wasn't a single worm beneath the lawn when we pulled it off. And she's a biologist. She wanted a garden. She wanted to grow, some of our own food. Wasn't ambitious enough to try and grow fiber for our own clothing, but she wanted to basically restore fertility to our land for her garden. And what was her recipe? Returning organic matter to the land. So recycling dead plant matter. So the wood chips you see around that wheelbarrow, the plant clippings that went into the wheelbarrow, the lawn clippings, our kitchen scraps. We basically composted and mulched the hell out of the yard for about 10 years, and we were able to turn that khaki soil over here that had about 1% organic matter into this rich dark earth over on the right-hand side that is pushing 10% organic matter in about a decade. That we've raised it about 1% per year, which if you're able to do that on farmland all around the world, all the world's farmland, you could sequester the lion's share of our current fossil fuel emissions. Now, it would be ambitious to do this on farmland all over the world, but the point is that we can actually rebuild soil fertility really fast. And what does it take? Recycling organic matter. And that's our tie into the circular economy, because it's taking the remains of plants that we're no longer using and returning them to the landscape. And that made us ask the question of, well, if we can actually restore soil on a small urban lot in Seattle fairly quickly, could you do this on working farms around the world? And that led to the third book in what Ann and I call our Dirt Trilogy, and that's Growing a Revolution, Bringing Our Soil Back to Life, which interviewed farmers around the world who had turned soil like this in the left-hand soil auger into soil over there on the right. This particular example is from Ratan Lal's experimental plots at the Ohio State University. And you'll notice the color change. That's the same kind of color change on that plant, that farm from North Carolina that I showed you, and the same kind of color change in our yard. It's all about putting carbon back in the soil in terms of turning relatively infertile earth back into fertile earth. And why is that? It's because the practices that build soil organic matter feed microbial life in the soil that are really the biologic catalysts, if you will, of soil fertility. And so when I visited farmers around the world to write Growing a Revolution, what I noticed is that the ones who'd been most successful in rebuilding soil organic matter on their land practiced a system of farming that was some variant of one that followed the principles of conservation agriculture, that involved minimal or no disturbance to the land. So a minimal amount of working on the surface of the soil, or going to fully no-till and not plowing. It involved planting permanent ground cover. So they're either cover crops in between cash crops, or literally crops in between the rows of cash crops, and a diversity of crops. So not growing just corn and soybeans, for example, but growing at least 4 or 5 crops in a rotation, so that the same piece of ground saw a succession of different crops over time. And why did these practices work fairly well to rapidly restore soil organic matter? It's because they cultivate beneficial life in the soil. That's what all these little microbes are doing up here on the screen. And if you think about what you would do to cultivate life that in the soil that actually benefited crops, you would stop disturbing them, you would feed them, and you would give them partners to work with. You would give them a diverse community. That maps directly onto those 3 principles. These 3 principles map directly onto is the antithesis of how we've trained farmers in conventional agriculture for the last 100 years or so, where we taught people to plow a lot, to use a lot of agrochemicals, and to specialize in 1 or 2 crops. So this is a different philosophy, a new way to think about farming that will leave the land better off as a consequence of intensive agriculture, as opposed to degrading it the way agriculture has done around the world for millennia, since the dawn of agriculture, with just a few exceptions in civilizations that I talked about in Dirt that actually are pretty interesting examples in and of themselves. So what can the application of those principles do on working North American farms? This shows you an example from David Brandt's farm in Carroll, Ohio, where between 1971 and 2014, he took this khaki, hard baked soil and turned it into this rich black chocolate cake. It's a very dramatic difference in terms of organic matter. This is the one he started with, had less than 1%, about 1% or so. He's now up to about 6 to 8%. It's higher than the native soil from before European arrival in this area. The other example I'll show you is from Gabe Brown's ranch in North Dakota. Again, he's a regenerative farmer that practices these principles of conservation agriculture, but he also raises livestock on the land through regenerative grazing. And he's taken soil that looked about like this and turned it into soil that looks like this. And as you can tell from the color difference, the one that he's holding higher in his right hand has a lot more organic matter than the one in the left. He's been able to so improve the fertility of his land that he no longer uses fertilizers or pesticides. And he also saves greatly on his diesel bill, as does David Brandt, because they don't drive their tractors around their fields as much, because they're not plowing and they're not fertilizing and they're not spraying pesticides. So what are some of the benefits of rebuilding soil fertility? The farmers that I just showed you have higher profits than their conventional neighbors because they're spending less to grow as much. They have comparable yields, but they have lower expenses. That's a recipe for a more profitable farm. Why is it more profitable? They use less fertilizer, less pesticide, and less fossil fuel. Those are three of the big ticket expenses on a modern farm in North America. But what it also does is it increases the amount of carbon in their soil. It gives them better water retention and less off-site pollution, benefits that benefit society at large as well. But that, if we look at that third component of the principles of conservation agriculture, that's where we really start to get into rethinking the overall system of agriculture and the potential for a regenerative and circular economy to try and to provide us with what I call the 4 F's of food, fodder, fiber, and fuel. And that's where the tie to clothing comes in. Because if we think about how you get a diversity of crops on a farm, well, if farms everywhere were growing crops tailored to each of those 4 F's, all of a sudden you already have that diversity of at least 4 crops if they were rotated through the same piece of land. So it's not much of a stretch to argue that thinking about reintegrating sort of food and fodder and fiber for the textile industry actually could have a place in regenerative agriculture, as potentially could some styles of biofuel production. And I just like this quote from Anna Brismar in terms of what circular fashion may be from the Green Strategy in 2017. It's worth reading, so I'll read it to you. Circular fashion can be defined as clothes, shoes, or accessories that are designed, sourced, produced, and provided with the intention to be used and circulate responsibly and effectively in society for as long as possible in their most valuable form, and hereafter return safely to the biosphere when no longer of human use. In other words, we should be growing fibers to make clothes out of that are grown with these regenerative farming practices that I was just discussing, but then also think about composting our clothes when we're done with them, handing them down and handing them around as long as they can remain viable, and then returning them to the land. And that has a lot of implications for how we think about this whole linked cycle of resource use and production and waste management and consumption. And I like this figure, not just because it's got, play on the little infinity symbol, but also because it really highlights how central thinking about the soil can be to the process of doing a regenerative and sustainable clothing industry, and that we're thinking not just about how we make clothes and use clothes, what we do with it, but in returning clothing back to the land so the decomposers can restore them and get them back into the plants and the animals that we would use to grow the fibers that we would clothe ourselves with. The opportunity to rethink how we treat the soil is central to thinking about how we make a circular economy out of not only the food system, but also our clothing system, because they're both soundly rooted in the soil. So I don't want to take the whole time up with talking about these things. If you're interested in detail, I recommend these 3 books. Every spring I teach a seminar where we read the 3 books and have a discussion seminar. And I know there's a few people in this class that are in that class. I look forward to talking with you all more on Friday about the 3rd book. And if others are interested, I hope to be teaching it again next spring and would welcome any of you in the class. And if anyone wants to reach out and connect with us, our website and Twitter feed are down at the bottom. We welcome engagement or questions there. So I will stop sharing at this point and would be delighted to engage in discussions or questions.
Wow, Dave, that was such a blast through a lot of complicated things. And students, there's a lot here, and I can't wait to hear some of the questions you have to ask Dave. And it looks like Catherine's got us started off here. And Catherine, go ahead and turn your camera on if you don't mind while you ask your question, just so it works best with the YouTube system. And Dave, is this all right? We'll just fire away here. And if we get stalled out, don't worry. I have 1,000 questions of my own. So
Sure, no, this is fine. Hi, Catherine.
Hi, David. My question is kind of specific. It's about how you said your wife kind of made your soil at your own house like a lot more fertile. Is that like what is the process for that? Like if anybody here wanted to like individually try and improve the soil in their home, like do you need a compost bin? Can you just put it like straight on the soil, or how does that work?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. We go into a lot of detail about what she did on her yard in the book, so I'll obviously refer you to that. But the short answer is compost and mulch, compost and mulch, compost and mulch. And there's different ways to make compost and mulch. And so you want to pay attention to the ingredients that go into it, and you want to pay attention to the mix of what's in it. And if you're doing compost, I wouldn't put your food scraps in the kitchen. I wouldn't just go sprinkle them around the yard. I would definitely, invest in a worm bin or get worms to do the work for you. I mean, one of the real lessons that Ann and I took away from restoring the yard was that we didn't have to do all the work. What the trick is providing the habitat and the resources for soil life to do the work for you. Because there's a lot more of them than there are of us, and they work 24/7, and they do it for free. All you have to do is give them our cast off stuff we don't want anymore. And she would be composting and mulching, our yard clippings. We'd get leaves from the neighbors' yards. Coffee grounds from a coffee shop are a great source of nitrogen. And if you take wood chips and coffee grounds and like hedge trimmings, you can make great mulch out of that. So there's lots of different ways to think about it. One of the other things that we did is that she brewed up what's known as compost tea. So we would take we have a worm bin for our kitchen scraps, and that turns the kitchen scraps into this beautiful black earth over the course of months, as long as the raccoons don't get in and they like to come and harvest the worms every now and then. But that makes really good stuff, and it drips liquid out the bottom of it that is full of microbes. And so one of the things that Ann had done is she would inoculate a batch of molasses-rich water with a bubbler with the juice from the compost bin, and it's basically making compost tea, which you can use to inoculate soil that doesn't have much soil life in it. You can really sort of reintroduce life directly into it. But the basic principles are feed the microbes. But then there's different ways to do it. There's a lot of good books. There's a great new book on no-till home vegetable production, if you want to do like a vegetable garden in the yard, that Brian O'Hara wrote. But Ann tells a lot of her secrets in the hidden half of nature.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Right, Josh, I think you might be next up, and then we'll move to Ava.
Yeah, thank you. I have a lot of questions, but I think a good starting point is in dirt. You say that we can read the record previous societies left inscribed in their soil to help determine if a sustainable society is even possible. I'm interested, how does the evolution of land from like a geomorphological point of view impact that record?
That's a great question. And that's one that in particular, a lot of archaeologists have A, made mistakes about, and B, been very interested in. Because if you think about where you would look for the archaeological record, you don't want to be looking in places where erosion is naturally going to strip it off. You want to look at it in places where it's going to be preserved. So in terms of where you would look for artifacts, there's some guidance that can be done there in part. One of the things you see in soils in different parts of the world is that there are different processes that contribute to the character that they will have. So when you go to different, say, ancient civilizations in different parts of the world, you'll be looking for different clues as to what should be there and what's missing. So you can basically take the geomorphological or the physical geography template as what you might expect to be able to find. And that's one of the things, like on those farms in North Carolina, the soil A horizon, the topsoil horizons are just gone. You have the subsoil right at the surface. So you can kind of read the record in what's missing from what you would expect naturally to be there. One of the techniques I've used all over the world that's really quite powerful and instructive in that regard is to go to where you can find undisturbed native soils and dig a hole. And find out what is actually there, and then see what's on the farm fields or around the ruins. If you go to Greece or Italy, around ruins there, how do those compare? But you also have to be aware of that your position on the landscape is going to shape what it is you'd expect to find there. So it's kind of a triangulation process of trying to read the land and understand how natural processes shape soils in. Like if you're in a low spot, a hillslope hollow, you'd expect a different soil profile than if you're on the ridge top. So you've got, so it's actually really beneficial to have training in how to read the land to then go be able to read the human imprint on the land. And I kind of stumbled into this, being somebody who, was trained how to read erosional processes and landforms initially. And then I started working around the world and noticing the human overprint on it and thought it was real interesting, kind of got carried away with it.
Thank you.
Ava, I think you were next.
Yeah.
Hi, David. It's so good to see you.
And vice versa.
Yes, I had a question specifically when you were talking about composting your clothing. There was a Vogue article that you provided where there's an emphasis on the reuse portion at the end of a product's life, where materials sometimes get composted to turn to biological nutrients for microorganisms in the soil. And then after just reading Hidden Half of Nature, I wanted to ask, can there be negative effects of this on the soil's microbiome after clothes are being reused for such a long period of time?
That's a great question. I don't really know the answer because I'm not sure people have really looked very much at it. But there's the one initial caveat I would offer would be that you probably don't want to be recycling all that microfleece and microfiber that really actually isn't good food for microbes. Although there's probably some microbe in the soil that will decompose the plastics that's made out of. But I think that that's a really good question. I'm not sure of the answer to. It probably depends somewhat on what has been added, how clothing may be treated. So when you look at, say, a shirt like this, and one of the things that looking into all this has gotten me to do is sort of change my clothing buying habits. So I'm trying now to buy more natural fibers, and if possible, know how they were raised. That's not always possible when you're buying clothing. But in terms of thinking about what the nature of how it may have been treated, and so it's not just the fibers that go into it, it's all the other things that may be treated with and added. And I'm certainly not an expert on that, but you could anticipate that whatever it is that it's made out of will favor certain organisms in the soil and not others. And so that, the simplest answer in terms of what would probably be best for the soil would be the cleanest natural fibers one could find. That said, there's a whole bunch of weird microbes that will decompose plastics and do other things. I wonder, I don't know, but I wonder whether we might be able to find microbes that are actually well tailored to taking some of this polypro clothing that we have so much of in the world now and turning it into something that might be better for the soil. But we might have to do research to figure out what those organisms would be that could actually help with that recycling. But that's a great question. I don't really know the answer to it.
That's okay. You provided sufficient information, but it was such a pleasure to see you and hear you. And I'll talk to you more on Friday.
That sounds great. I'll see you then.
Okay, sounds good.
Eva, I love that question. And I think, Dave, it really gets to the heart of like some of the questions that are on my mind when I think about circularity. Because, for us here, as we're growing, we're applying a lot of compost, and at the UW farm, certainly we apply a lot of compost, and we're using a lot of Cedar Grove compost, which I don't know if you and Ann have run into this in your efforts, but, I started talking to a friend of mine recently about how I want to make compost as good as the compost they make at Cedar Grove. And my friend shook her head and said, but dude, Eli, where are you going to get all that plastic from? And and I'm putting out this compost, and the other day, I was flame weeding a bed, and like it smelled a little plasticky, and
you're melting your soil.
Right, not too great. So I'm just curious do you know anything about microplastics in the soil and their effects on microbial ecology or plant health? Is that something that you and Ann have done any work on?
No, I have not. I have not done any, sort of focused looking into that, but we've done a pretty major dive into soil ecology for writing The Hidden Half of Nature, and I couldn't find any research on. Well, we didn't run across any research on that topic. I think it sounds to me like it would be a great topic for someone to maybe do a master's or PhD thesis on. If there's anyone out there looking for a thesis topic, that would make a great question. You know, what is the fate of that stuff? How much is in different kind of compost? Who eats it? Who benefits from it? And who is harmed by it?
Awesome. Students, are there other questions here for Dave? Oh, sorry, my dog is barking.
That's okay. Can you send your dog over here? I could use a dog for.
Oh, she's so sweet.
Yeah.
Joash has a second question for you, and you know, I'm gonna start mining the Canvas page for some questions.
Yeah, it's kind of just in direct relation because you have a direct experience with, oh, you used a specific term, but refertilizing your soil. And that was on your own home in North Seattle. And I'm currently learning about the history of North Seattle from like a systemic point of view about the history that surrounds that area. And I'm interested. It kind of centers around communication. It isn't a fully formed thought or question, but like ownership of land has a direct impact on the responsibility that one feels to that land. So how do we reframe this idea of the clothing I wear has a relationship to the land that I occupy? Yeah, I don't know, kind of an abstract thought that hopefully you can help narrow down if possible.
Well, that's a very interesting question. I've worked a lot on sort of the nature of land tenure, on how farmers treat their land, but I haven't thought about it much through the lens of clothing and how you then translate that to us as individuals, thinking back and tracing back to the farm. But there's parallels with when we think about our diet in terms of when we think about, when we go out to dinner or when we prepare a meal. How many of us are really thinking about, well, what did the farmers do to the land that this food was grown on? And what will that mean for future people being able to raise food off that same piece of land? And that's sort of at the heart of the question you're asking, but translated into the clothing world. And I don't have great answers in terms of how we would pull that off, but there is an information gulf in the way that we raise, develop, and market and purchase clothing as well as food, where you don't really know. You might know something about the fabric, but you don't really know about what the farming practices were that raised it, unless it's labeled as organic. That's kind of the only label that's sort of widely out there in terms of being able to assess that. And what that would tell you is whether or not certain classes of chemicals were actually used on the land in raising that fiber or that food. It doesn't necessarily tell you how well the farmers took care of the land. Because there's, the farmers back in classical Greece and Rome that destroyed their land did it without agrochemicals. They were perfectly capable of doing that in an organic farming situation. So there's a real, I think, information gap that would need to be filled to be able to do what you're asking about, which would be able to get, well, I guess there's two things. There's an awareness gap. There's a gap of getting people to think about when they look at a clothing purchase, oh, what does this mean for how it treated the land? But then there's also the information gap of, well, even if they're aware, do they have access to the information to actually make a decision that would be in line with their values? And we're kind of missing on all fronts at the moment in that. So there's a lot of work that can be done to do that. But there's, 10 years ago, there was very little discussion about sort of circular product design in manufacturing industries. And now there's laws, say in Germany, I think, that the producers of a product are responsible for the ultimate recycling and disposal of those products, as well as the packaging, if I'm remembering right. And so one could hope that in the not too distant future, that same kind of thinking is going to spread into the food and the fashion world. And that one of the reasons I agreed that Ann and I accepted doing this talk for a fashion conference a couple of years ago in New York was it was novel to us. We're like, but we're soil people. It's like, why do you want to talk to us? And the woman who was organizing the conference was just so passionate and so excited about making this connection between the choices people make in their clothing and how they could potentially reshape the fashion industry to be more sustainable by getting greater awareness of the connection back to the land, that it gave me hope that there's a lot of room to obviously improve those connections, but there's a long way to go to do it. Sorry, that's a long and kind of sideways answer to your question, but it's a great question to ask.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, because I know in your intro to dirt, you referenced the 1930s Dust Bowl, and I'm currently learning about that in my environmental history course. And William Cronin's work surrounding that talks about it not so definitively. It makes it abstract, it makes it complex. And I appreciate the complexity of the issue, because there's work to be done.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done. Yeah, but no, the whole field of environmental history is fascinating, and it's ripe for reanalysis in some corners of it, and from just broadening of the analysis. But I'm a sucker for it. I enjoy it.
This is fascinating. Dave, I'm curious about when you think about fibers that can be grown that feed soil well, right? I mean, cotton is certainly one of the most commonly grown crops in the U.S. It's in the top 4. But there are other crops, right, that lend themselves to fiber production. I'm thinking of like flax. I'm thinking of hemp.
The highest one in terms of fiber production is hemp. The stalks are just incredibly fiber rich. So, I mean, you can harvest a fiber rich fiber, but what's left over from not going into fiber production is very fiber rich. It's great microbe food.
Mm-hmm. And what do you know anything about I've gone down a rabbit hole with flax. Just like, oh gosh, like flax is beautiful, right? And I love it. And like, okay, I could grow a lot of flax on my farm, but actually flax is like a really difficult, you can't just turn flax into linen. Turns out it's quite complicated, and challenging. It's like physically exhausting process. And, I'm just curious I don't know how these things used to happen, like how we used to have linen production, right? I mean, there was a lot of flax production at one point in the US, and I don't think there's very much at all right now.
Yeah, no, it makes beautiful clothing, but I have no idea, I have no real knowledge of the process of going from the crop to the actual fabric. Have almost no knowledge of that. And I'm sure that if I was doing it, I would screw it up.
Awesome. Well, I'm curious about it, and I'm going to look into it more. But what I know is it requires like a lot of thrashing and beating and breaking apart the fibers.
Maybe I could do that.
Yeah, I think it's possible. It's just time consuming and hard. But meanwhile, I think Sean, do you have some questions that have come into you from the?
Sure. I'm happy to ask a question on behalf of the students. Excuse me all. So I guess one thing that's come up in part in discussions of sort of circularity, and since you are someone who cares about soils, it seemed like this is appropriate because of course food, fiber, fodder, and fuel are all things that you were thinking about. Do we run the risk of, when we start thinking about circularity in our clothing or trying to come up with more sustainable clothing, in using land to produce things like fiber for clothing, do we run the risk of using the land for those purposes at the detriment of providing enough food, for instance, for people? Is that anything that we should be concerned about?
Well, I think, we should be concerned about that, but we should also be concerned about our other major alternative for clothing production at present is making them out of fossil fuels, which is, exacerbates a whole nother set of problems. So, as is true with so many issues in sustainability, it's a question of sort of balancing trade-offs. If you look at a lot of the land production in agriculture in the US today, though, goes for growing biofuels and feeding cars and feeding cows. We could actually, if we actually reintroduce livestock into grazing grasslands and restored native grasslands, we could free up a whole lot of agricultural land to grow food for people. And if we grew vegetables instead of corn and soybeans, we could feed the world without anywhere near the land that we do, as we're mostly granivores at the moment. And that's something that is only evolved in the last 10,000 years of our history, and it has had huge human health consequences for us, especially when we switched to ultra processed foods in the last few decades. So I have yet to see sort of what I would consider a rigorous and formal accounting of, if we were to use the world's agricultural land regeneratively, so that we could sustain production with a minimum of fossil fuel and agrochemical use. And we were to grow those 4 F's of food, fodder, fiber, and fuel. How many people could we support? And what does that mean for, biofuels? Maybe it means we need to go to all electric vehicles and, take the fuel part out of the agricultural land piece, because there's lots of variables to it. At the moment, we grow enough food to feed everybody on the land, more than enough, actually. If we took the problem of the perceived gap between organic food production and conventional food production, which is usually pegged at between about 5 and 10%. But if you actually have healthy, fertile soil, it's about 0 in terms of net yield. But if you basically look at the magnitude of food waste globally, it's something like what, 1/4 to 1/3 of the food that we produce never gets eaten by anybody. So what we're actually wasting is bigger than the gap that we have in feeding people now. And so there's a lot of different dimensions to that problem that could be juggled. But yeah, we should be concerned about it. We should worry about it. But I'm not necessarily convinced that we face a fundamental trade-off between having more sustainable livestock, human food, and clothing. I think if we did it right, we could actually achieve all those objectives. And perhaps, but again, I have not seen a full formal accounting of how you would do that with regenerative practices at a global scale.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Dave, for that. The other question that came up. Oh, you know what? Maria's got a question. Let's have Maria ask her question first, and then I will follow up with this other question.
Hi. Oops. My question is, I don't know if you can answer this, but I'm trying to figure out which fibers are the most sustainable, which fibers, are the best to, when I go shopping, to choose. And so I'm thinking, I know bamboo is a great fiber, but it's very labor intensive, or else they use too many chemicals to break down the fibers. So that's been an issue. And then you mentioned hemp, and I thought that was a good sustainable fiber. I don't know if it has the same problems. Eli mentioned flax. I'm thinking about silk as well, and how growing these fibers affects the soil. So even silk would probably affect the soil, because you have to grow, the plants that the silkworms eat. So I'm wondering what your opinion is on this.
Yeah, the way I tend, it's a great question. And the way I tend to think about it is that you've got sort of 2 independent dimensions to it. There's the choice of crop, and then there's how it's raised. And they're both important. Because in terms of the choice of crop, it's going to affect sort of the post-harvest processing and how that all sort of plays through the production process. I'm really not very familiar with the impacts of that, so I'll probably refrain from commenting on it. But that would be, the top 2 of my list would be hemp and linen, or hemp and flax, linen. But across the board, the differences in the way that people actually treat the land in the farming process is probably the bigger difference. So there's like sustainable cotton, and there's really degradational cotton. And the same as you can grow hemp in a way that could destroy the land. So a lot of it boils down to understanding what the practices of the farmers actually are. And that's where we have a huge information gap, because that's not on the label of the clothing you buy. So what we kind of need is a label that says, soil safe clothing. If any of you are entrepreneurial and want to start something like that, go for it. I think it would be a very interesting innovation. But at the moment, the only real clue you have in the marketplace is whether something is organic or not. And it's an imperfect bit of information in terms of how that affects the soil. But it's generally organic practices will be better for the soil than conventional practices, but they still might not be sustainable over the long run.
Thank you.
Sure.
Dave, I'm really struck by your answer to that question. Maria, I thank you for bringing that out, because it's making me think about this other piece, right, that we come up against all the time as farmers. Like, farmers are, we're practical people, business people too. And, like, I can grow chickens super sustainably on my farm. And I can actually, because of where my farm is located, I can sell my chickens for like $6 a pound, right? When I harvest my chickens, which that turns into be like a $30 bird, like a $30 chicken. People buy it. I sell out every time I grow chickens. And people ask me, when are you going to do it again? And, um, but I bet, I don't know what the price of chicken in the store is, but I'm sure it's not $6 a pound. Does anyone know what the price of chicken in the store is? The point is, you wouldn't buy very many chickens if you had to pay $6 a pound for chicken, right? But like, I am guilty, as probably most people in this seminar are. Like, I have more than one piece of clothing, right? Like, I have lots of clothing. I love changing I have to change my clothes like multiple times in one day. And today I didn't change my clothes. I just came running in off the tractor. But a lot of times I put on a better shirt when I see students. And so I feel, where am I going here? Okay, well, okay, like, what's in your closet, right? Like, I don't know. It's hard to make these choices, and I think there is a price thing that's going to come up when we start talking about what sustainable fashion looks like, and using fibers from the kind of agriculture you're talking about is going to be a more costly, more costly experience.
Yeah, it may be. One of the things I was really quite surprised by in researching Growing a Revolution was the actually low cost of production from some of the regenerative farmers. Now, they were growing crops, not fiber crops, but a number of them were basically saying that, their production costs were actually lower than conventional production costs. But that may not translate over into chickens or fiber or other kind of things. I suspect it's very much crop or animal dependent. But that's we also have fairly good access today to the ability to recycle clothing through things like eBay or the neighborhood free list. There's lots of sort of ways to repurpose clothing and sustain its usable lifetime before it ends up getting composted, even if it is compostable.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the best thing we should do with all those polypro jackets that are running around is just bury them somewhere and return them into the geologic record.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I have some follow-up questions, but I want to make sure Joash has time to ask his question. Do you want to?
Yeah, it's a little off topic, and it's kind of just directly related to your area of study, Dave. Is it fair to characterize geomorphology as like the evolution of land, or no?
Yeah, it is. It's basically the processes that shape the surface of the earth. So the evolution of landforms and landscapes, that would be a very nice, succinct definition of it.
So I'm with that in mind. Is there an existing analogy for the concept of mutation within geomorphology?
But the concept of mutation?
Yeah, because when I think about evolution, I'm thinking about genetics and its relationship to just, I don't know, alleles and whatnot. So, but mutation plays a major role in evolution in that whole process. So I'm wondering, is there that analogy follow through?
That is a terrific question. I've never thought about it in quite those terms. That's a really good question. I'm not going to give you a terribly intelligent off-the-cuff answer, but I'm not aware of a good analogy. Most of the focus in geomorphology is actually figuring out more like Mendelian genetics in terms of that analogy, sort of how things work, and it'd be more like the structure of DNA and how the transmission of that through transcriptase and messenger RNA and all that kind of stuff works, the mechanics of how the information handoff proceeds. The errors in it as central to developing new things is a very interesting idea, and I've just never thought about it in terms of geomorphology before. That's a terrific question. That's a really clever question, and I'm just not sure. If I reflected on it for longer, I might be able to give you some examples of it, but that's a really good question.
Gotcha. I'll shoot you an email. Thanks
Yeah,
for your time, Dave.
that's a very cool idea. It's a very cool idea. Maria, looks like you have another question.
Yeah. So this question was about burying those fiber or those jackets, those plastic jackets. So there is a concept of bioengineering bacterias and things that can eat plastic and eat, the fossil fuel type. How dangerous is that to the soil? What is the risk to something like genetically engineering things that will eat fossil fuels to get rid of them?
That's a great question. I'm not going to give you a terribly authoritative answer on it. But one of the things that I think one can say about the microbial world is there probably already is something out there that can eat that stuff without being genetically engineered. And the question is how to find the right stuff, and then whether or not that could have an impact on the soil environment would affect very much how you would want to isolate or position that for that biodegradation process. So my sort of intellectual prejudice is that if there's a natural system that can be engaged, then why engineer one that might have potentially unknown side effects? So I gave a TED talk up in Vancouver, BC, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago on a book that I wrote about the history of science and religion. And TED Talks are a really weird thing to do for some of these sort of short format ones. But the talk either right before me or maybe two before me was one given by two, I think they were junior high girls from Vancouver, Canada, who had been trying to think about how to clean up an industrial site that had been polluted with phthalates, sort of a nasty industrial chemical. And what they did is they basically took a sample of soil from the site and basically immersed it in phthalates and basically kept breeding microbes that could survive exposure to the toxin to the point where they were able to culture a colony of microbes that ate the toxin and did the biodegradation, and then they released that on the site and cleaned it up. And I was sitting there going, I've just been shamed by two, girls, middle school science girls with their science project. I was just blown away by how clever they were and how well it worked. And so that's sort of by means of an example of a different alternative to genetically engineering something that could eat that particular compound. They went and they cultured something just through the accelerated process of not really evolution, but just natural selection, the driver of evolution. And it worked amazingly well. So my intellectual prejudice would be that would be the safer way to go. But you might still, well, anyway, that's kind of how I tend to think about it.
Thank you. That's a great answer. I'm going to look up your TED Talk too.
Awesome. Dave, we have really enjoyed this time with you. It's really fun to hear you just think a little bit about how the circular economy overlaps with regenerative practices and how that intersects with sustainability in fashion. And we've been learning so much this quarter about all that's in front of us as we move into thinking about how to help move the fashion industry more forward in a sustainable way. And so it's really wonderful to have soil part of that conversation today. Do we have any final, what's that?
Happy to weigh in on it. It's fun to think about.
Yeah, it is. Are there any students out there with a final question for Dave? Sean, do you have a final question?
I don't have a final question because I think we've already heard some really good ones already from the students. I think it's, this has been really great food for thought, Dave, to think not only about our clothes and about the sort of fiber that they're made out of, but also thinking about that connection to the land. And if we really want to focus on circularity, we also have to think about protecting the land, protecting the soil, so we can continue growing things on them. So, I think just imagining these fields where cotton and sort of the conventional sense has been grown for 100 plus years in some certain parts of the U.S. and elsewhere, and what kind of effect that's having on the soils in those places. It is definitely worth considering the next time any of us make choices about the clothing that we choose.
Well, Dave, we'll give you a nice virtual round of applause here. Thank you so much for joining us in the seminar.
Thank you.
Students, there is no question for today because Sean and I realized if I'm the host, I can't be the host if Sean's YouTubing and I don't know how to YouTube, and so you're off the hook for today. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you all, and thank you, Dave. Really do appreciate you joining us.
No worries. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Dave.